Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahim. Today, inshallah, we are going to start in chapter 9, which is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and inflation. So, let's go to the first point, which is the goods market and the money market. As you know, that the goods market is the market in which goods and services are exchanged and the which equilibrium level of aggregate output is determined. And the money market is what? هذا كله أخذنا. So let's go to the aggregate demand. The aggregate demand is the total demand for goods and services in the economy. The aggregate demand هو الطلب الكلي عمليا, which is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. This is the aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure. To derive the aggregate demand curve, as you know, in the simple economy or the microeconomics, the demand curve is what? Or has a negative slope, which illustrates the negative relationship between the prices and the quantity demanded for goods and services, right? The aggregate demand curve has a negative slope, which illustrates the negative relationship between the prices and aggregate output. In the last chapter, or chapter 8, if you remember, when the prices increased, increasing the prices leads to increasing the money demand, which leads to a rightward shifting in the money demand curve, which leads to increasing of the interest rate, right? A decreasing in I, decrease aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand, and decreasing Y, right? So, in general, here we have a negative relationship between the prices and the aggregate output, which is illustrated by the aggregate demand curve. This is the shape of the aggregate demand curve. So let's come back here to the figures. We have three figures. The first one is related to the money market. The first equilibrium is MD note here. The equilibrium A note, right? This is E note, E0. This is a QM D or a QM note, right? When the prices increased, the money demand increased. So there is a rightward shifting in the money demand curve from MD note to MD1, which leads to A1, which leads to an increasing in the interest rate. So this is the investment, as you see, the planned investment curve, which illustrates the negative relationship between R and I. So this is E note, R note, I note. There is an increasing in the interest rate to R1, E1, and the planned investment should decline to I1, right? In this case, the decreasing in the planned investment leads to a decreasing in the aggregate expenditure, which is the aggregate demand. So here, this is the goods and services market. This is the initial equilibrium point at Y naught here, right? The decreasing and the aggregate, the planned investment leads to a backward shifting or downward shifting in the aggregate expenditure function. صح؟ هيو إجا وين؟ Here. To E1, which leads to a decreasing in the planned or the aggregate equilibrium output. مظبوط ولا لا؟ صح؟ هذا اللي أخذناه في chapter 8. So let's derive the aggregate demand curve. As we mentioned, that the aggregate demand shows the negative relationship between Y and the prices. So as you see, the aggregate demand curve is a curve, shows what? The negative relationship between the aggregate output or income and the price levels. So you can see that the aggregate demand curve has a negative slope. مظبوط ولا لا؟ تمام. So suppose this is the price at P1. We have Y note, P note, Y note, The increasing the prices leads to a decreasing in Y to Y1 and so on. Right? And the analysis, you can see the analysis here. Increasing the prices leads to decreasing or increase. So the increasing the prices leads to increasing money demand, increasing R, decreasing I, and decreasing the aggregate expenditure, which is the aggregate demand, and finally Y would decline. تمام؟ The aggregate demand curve or the aggregate demand is more complex than the simple demand, because when we were talking about the demand, the simple economy and the microeconomics, we were talking about one good, the demand for one product, one good, right? So it was easy to determine the relationship between the prices of tomatoes and the quantity demanded of tomatoes. But now we are talking about the aggregate demand for the economy as a whole. We are talking about the demand for a household sector, for the firm sector, for the government, and the outside sector, right? Or the rest of the world. So the aggregate demand is more complex than, or more complicated than, the simple demand. So as you see here, the higher price causes the demand for money. The higher prices cause the demand for the money demand to increase, then the interest rate to increase. This is the slide. تمام? All points along, or all points, yes, all points along the aggregate demand curve illustrates an equilibrium points on the goods and services market and the money market. Because if we come back to this, we can see we have derived the aggregate demand curve from these two figures. مظبوط؟ احنا من وين اشتقينا الاجريجيت demand؟ من الماني ماركت والجودز and services market. وبالتالي هنا these are equilibrium points. مظبوط؟ واللي reflected هان في الاناليسيس هذا. Increasing the prices وصلنا لوين؟ the decreasing Y. So here we're talking about a goods and services market and money market. So each point along the aggregate demand curve illustrates the negative relationship between prices
and the quantity demanded.
Exactly. Why? Exactly. Why? The aggregate output and what? Equilibrium points in the both two markets, the goods and services market and the money market, right? Okay. What about the consumption? The increasing of prices. Suppose that the prices increased. Leads to a decreasing in the consumption. Because the decreasing here in Y leads to a decreasing in the consumption. So there is a negative relationship between the prices and consumption. Right? What about the real wealth? ثروتك الحقيقية لما الأسعار بتطلع شو بصير في real wealth? Will decline as well. So there is also a negative relationship between the prices and the real wealth. مظبوط؟ Let's go to the main reasons or factors affect the aggregate demand to shift to the right or the left. Here we are talking about the policies that used by the government to stimulate the economy or to affect the economy, right? Suppose that we used an expansionary monetary policy. What should happen to the aggregate demand curve? طبعا احنا متفقين ان aggregate demand is what؟ اللي هو C plus I aggregate demand C plus I plus G plus X minus M. This is the aggregate expenditure اللي هو at equilibrium بيكون شو عندنا الوضع؟ Y equals aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure. مظبوط؟ طيب what are the main causes for or the main reasons for the shifting in aggregate demand curve? Let's use an expansionary fiscal policy and analyze the effect on the aggregate demand curve. Increasing money supply leads to what? A decreasing in R, increase I, increase aggregate expenditure or increase aggregate demand. So there is what? A rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. مظبوط? So here we have a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand node 0 to aggregate demand 1 by what? Or due to the increasing money supply or using an expansionary monetary policy. Type. And vice versa. If we use a contractionary monetary policy by decreasing the money supply, which leads to a increasing R, decrease I, decrease aggregate expenditure or a decreasing aggregate demand. So there is a leftward shifting exactly in the aggregate demand from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand node. Right? What about the fiscal policy? Suppose that the government used an expansionary fiscal policy. What would happen to the aggregate demand curve? So let's use an expansionary fiscal policy by increasing the government spending or decreasing the taxes. This leads to increasing aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. That's it. So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve, which is illustrated here. An increase in the purchases of the government leads to, or a decrease in the net taxes shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. And the aggregate demand curve, and vice versa for sure, the decreasing in the government spending leads to a decrease in aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. So there is a leftward shifting in the aggregate demand curve, right? في شيء ambiguous? Easy, okay. So as you see in this table, the expansionary monetary or the expansionary monetary policy and the expansionary fiscal policy leads to what? The contractionary monetary and fiscal policy leads to what? In this table you can see that the expansionary monetary policy leads to increasing the aggregate demand or will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right and vice versa. If you use a contractionary monetary policy, the aggregate demand will shift to the left, and here we can see the expansionary fiscal policy leads to a rightward shifting and the aggregate demand and so on. Right? Okay. Let's go to the aggregate supply curve. In the simple economy, or when we studied the microeconomics, the supply curve has what? Exactly, the positive slope, which illustrates the positive relationship between the prices and the quantity supplied. So the increasing the prices will encourage the producers to produce more and more, so the aggregate output would increase. So in the simple economy, we can say that, or in the macroeconomics as well, the increasing the prices leads to increasing the aggregate, would encourage the producers to produce more and more, so the aggregate output would increase, right? So there is what? A positive relationship between the prices and the aggregate output which has been produced in the economy. So, yes, the quantity supplied, exactly. The total quantity supplied in the economy. So, we can define the aggregate supply as follows. The aggregate supply is the total supply of all goods and services in the economy, right? Which shows the positive relationship between the prices and the aggregate output. So we can say that when the prices increase, this leads to encourage the producers to produce more and more, then supply or the quantity supplied would increase, which means the aggregate output would increase. So there is a positive relationship between the prices and the aggregate output. And we can see that the aggregate supply curve as follows. Positive, and finally in the long term it should be a vertical line. هنشوف ليش بيكون باللونج تيرم بيكون a vertical line. تمام؟ شو ايش؟ حنيجي للاناليسيز نشوف بالshort term suppose from A to B and here from B to C it should be a vertical line. جايين للاناليسيز بالshort term والlong term وفقا للكينزيان view or the Keynesian school. تمام؟ طيب. So in the short term, the aggregate, according to the, here our analysis is related to the Keynesian view. وفقا للنظرية الكينزية هذا الشغل تبعنا حيكون تحليلنا كله على وفقا للنظرية أو الكينزيان سكول مش على الكلاسيك. تمام؟ As you see, we can derive the aggregate supply here into two parts. This is from A to B and from B to C. Right? What do you see? From A to B, it has a positive slope, right? Which means if the aggregate demand of, or if we shift from A to B, Y would increase. مظبوط? From Y0 or Y1 to Y2, right? مظبوط? From B to C, there is no change, or from here, suppose here is B, from B to C, there is no change in the aggregate output. So this is Y2 equals Y3. Right? طيب. هذا عند B. شو عندنا؟ هذا الماكسيموم كاباسيتي تبع الايكونومي. يعني أقصى حاجة ممكن ينتجها الاقتصاد عند Y2. That's it. مظبوط؟ طب بدي أروح شوية على إشي تاني. So, in the long term, the aggregate supply curve, which would be what? Vertical line. From A to B here, we can say it's a period related to the short term, from A to B. The short term, the aggregate output can be increased or decreased. هلا بالlong term, there is no change in the aggregate output. بمعنى suppose انه at هيك التحليل تبعنا لحظة from A to B. Suppose, or the equilibrium in the economy occurs when aggregate demand intersects aggregate supply. In general, التوازن في السوق بيكون لما aggregate demand بيساوي ايش aggregate supply. So let's draw the equilibrium in the market. This is the aggregate supply curve. Is it vertical here? Aggregate supply. And suppose here we have aggregate demand curve. The equilibrium occurs when aggregate demand intersects the aggregate supply. E1, the price, Y, P1, Y1, right? And this is aggregate demand 1, aggregate supply 1. هذا البيريود from this point من هان لهان هيك هذا short run. Suppose إنه A to B. From A to B, it's the short run. From B to C, it's the long run, right? From B to C, it's the long run. A to B is the short run, right? But now, suppose that the aggregate demand or the government used an expansionary fiscal policy. أجت الحكومة وش عملت expansionary fiscal policy by increasing the government spending. هذا شو بيعمل؟ Exactly, this leads to increasing aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. This leads to what? A rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. مظبوط? So we have a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve to aggregate demand 2. We have a new equilibrium point, which is E2. This leads to what? Increasing the prices from P1 to P2. At the same time, we have an increasing in the aggregate output. مظبوط? So, there is an increasing in the prices and increasing in Y, right? Suppose the central bank used also an expansionary monetary policy. اللي هو Federal Reserve System اجى عمل expansionary monetary policy by increasing the money supply. Decrease R, increase I, increase aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. So there is what? Additional increasing or shifting in the aggregate demand from aggregate demand 2 to aggregate demand 3. Suppose here we reach to the point B. Aggregate demand 3. So there is what? A rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. In this case, the prices increased to P3. At the same time, Y has increased to Y3. Right? Now, so what do you see? The fiscal policy is effective because the aggregate output increased. The monetary policy is effective also because Y increased, right? But now, let us suppose that the government also decided to increase its spending once again. يعني اجى الحكومة وقال لك بدنا نزود انفاقنا كمان مرة by increasing G. This leads to increasing. هنا عمل شو؟ increase Y وهنا كمان increased Y. هذا وين؟ short run from A to B. طب عند B هذا بسموها المنطقة نقطة الكاباسيتي أو بسموها full capacity utilization، الطاقة القصوى للاقتصاد إنه ينتج. خلص وصلنا لمنطقة إنه الاقتصاد هي أقصى حاجة ممكن ينتجه. بعد هيك the increasing the government spending leads to increasing aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure. صح؟ So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve, AD4. In this case, what do you see? Exactly, thank you. So the result is there is an increasing in the prices to B4, and there is no change in Y. Y3 equals Y4. إذن هذه السياسة المالية التوسعية or the expansion fiscal policy is ineffective. شو عملت لي؟ بس رفعت لي الأسعار، عملت لي inflation. صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ إذن في هاي الحالة suppose إن إحنا كنا عند BN at point N، الأصل إنه إحنا نعمل contraction of fiscal policy or contraction of monetary policy. كمان إذن at the capacity or after the capacity point or after the full capacity utilization, neither the fiscal policy nor the monetary policy is effective. لا هاد فعالة ولا هاي فعالة، يعني لا السياسة المالية فعالة ولا النقدية فعالة بعد النقطة هاي، لأنه كمان لو استخدمنا if use at point B زود المونey supply, increase the money supply, leads to decrease R, increase I, increase aggregate expenditure, increase aggregate demand with no increasing in the aggregate output. Right? صعب الأمور؟ إذا عند نقطة الطاقة القصوى هاي شو الوضع؟ بيكون وصلنا لمرحلة إنه مش قادر الاقتصاد ينتج أكثر من هيك، وبالتالي the increasing of the government spending or increasing the money supply leads to increasing in the prices, which means we have increasing in the inflation rate. تمام? Let's complete our talking about the aggregate supply curve. As we mentioned that we have two parts for the aggregate supply curve. Number one, or the first part is in the short run, which has a positive slope, which means in this case, an increasing in the aggregate demand leads to increasing in the aggregate output with increasing in the prices, right? In this part, from A to M, the aggregate demand curve will be flatter than from M to N. هلا كل ما بتروح هيك بصير ايش ماله؟ more has more slope. السلوب تبعه increased, right? طيب if the aggregate demand curve is in the first stage here, the increasing and the aggregate output would be larger than the increasing in the prices, which means it's more flexible or more elastic. صح؟ كل ما بتطلع بتروح هيك كل ما بصير الاجريجيت supply خلينا نشوفه هيك more steeper. هلا نشوف هن from A to B here. As you see, it's more elastic or more flatter, which means the increasing and the aggregate output is larger than the increasing in the prices. So the aggregate or the fiscal policy and the monetary policy would be more effective than from B to N, or from C to D, or from M to C. From M to C here, you can see that the curve or the aggregate supply curve is less elastic than from A to B, right? Hey, in this case, from M to C, the percentage change and the prices is larger than the change or the increase in Y. In this case, the fiscal policy would be, and the monetary policy would be less effective than the previous case from A to B, right? In general, the economists tried or focus on or studies or they study whether the economy is reached to the capacity or not, right? Okay. هذا أخذنا اللي هو when the economy operating at level low of output. شو الوضع؟ aggregate demand or increase في aggregate demand شو بيعمل؟ بيعمل larger increasing the aggregate output. هاي بالمراحل الدنيا هذه from A to B لما بيكون aggregate output small, أي زيادات في aggregate demand leads to larger increasing in the aggregate output than the increasing in the prices. صح؟ طيب. Let's analyze the relationship between the prices and the cost of a production. In general, the increasing in the prices leads to increasing in the wages. In general, the increasing in the prices leads to increasing the wages because the workers or the labor will ask their managers to increase their wages. غلاء المعيشة صحيح. So the wages would increase by the same amount of the prices. This is the assumption. عشان يعملوا compensation تعويضات increasing اللي صار في البرايسز. صح؟ عشان يحتفظوا بمعدلات مستوى معيشة ثابت. مظبوط؟ طيب. Which leads to increasing the cost of a production. Decrease the aggregate expenditure. Sorry, the aggregate supply. مظبوط؟ لأنه the cost of production increase, so that the aggregate supply would decline. Yes, the determinants of supply. So let's see the cost shock or supply shock. هذا اللي هو is a change in the cost that it changed the aggregate supply curve. Here, as you see, there is a leftward shifting in the aggregate supply curve from aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 2. Decreasing هذا من وين اجى؟ نتيجة انه the prices طلع, the wages increased, the cost of production increased, So the aggregate supply curve decline or will shift to the left. هذا بسموه اللي هو cost shock. And here, as you see, if the prices decline, leads to decreasing the wages with the same amount, decrease the cost of production, and then finally the aggregate supply would increase. So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate supply curve. صعبة؟ تمام. Here you can see the main factors that affect or variables shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right and to the left. So let's analyze each one, or analyze them one by one. The first variable is the lower cost. The lower wages, the lower cost of production leads to increasing the capacity or the ability for the producers to produce more, so the aggregate supply will shift to the right. So the lower cost means a decreasing the prices of inputs or decreasing the wages leads to increasing the ability to produce, which means the increasing the aggregate supply, or in this case the aggregate supply will shift to the right? And vice versa, the higher cost, right? What else? The economic growth. More capital, more machines, more labor, advanced technology. This leads to increasing the ability to produce, which will shift the aggregate supply to the right. So here we can see the economic growth, which increased or means increasing the capital, increasing new technology. What else? More labor. This leads to increasing the ability to produce, and then the aggregate supply would increase, and vice versa. Here you can see the stagflation. The public policies, if the government decrease the taxes, the supply side policies means encouraging the providing the producers with subsidies, تشريعات اللي لها علاقة بالتاكسز والهيك. كل هذا شو بيعمل rightward shifting or increasing the ability for the producers to produce more, which means increasing in the aggregate supply. There is a rightward shifting in the aggregate supply curve. And the good weather, it's related to the agricultural sector. If we have a good weather, we have a good environment to produce, and then the aggregate supply would increase. So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate supply curve. صعبة? And vice versa for sure. Right. Let's go to the equilibrium. As we mentioned maybe before 5 minutes, we draw the equilibrium in the market when the aggregate demand intersects the aggregate supply. Here we have the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium aggregate output. تمام؟ عملنا analysis لهذا. Okay. In this diagram you can see the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve, and this is the aggregate demand. هلا الاجريجيت ديماند كيرف شو عامل انترسكشن مع مين؟ مع الاجريجيت شورت ران aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply. وين اقصى نقطة قد يصل فيها الناتج او الايكوليبريم aggregate output. and the long run اللي هو الانترسكشن ما بين هاي الاجريجيت supply. خلينا نشوف هيك. Suppose we use an expansionary fiscal policy. Suppose that the government used an expansionary fiscal policy. شو بتعمل هذا في الاجريجيت demand؟ تمام. So we can see that there is a rightward shifting and the aggregate demand curve. مظبوط؟ هيو. Hey, this is the point A is the original equilibrium point where aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply intersects the aggregate demand node, and at the same time the long-run aggregate supply curve شو ماله؟ بيعمل intersection ما بينه وبين aggregate demand. مظبوط؟ Now suppose that we used an expansionary fiscal policy by increasing the government spending. This leads to increasing aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. هذا بودينا عوين from aggregate demand node to aggregate demand 1. مظبوط؟ رحنا على نقاط توازن جديدة. صح ولا لا؟ هذول this leads to increasing aggregate demand from aggregate demand node to aggregate demand 1. شو يعمل في البرايسز؟ شو يعمل في الاوتبوت؟ Here we have a new equilibrium point at B. Y increased and the price is increased. صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ طيب. اللي صار هنا انه when the price is increased شو يعمل في الكوست of a production؟ increased لأنه الwages طلعت. هلا this leads to increasing the wages, increase the cost of production. وين حيوديني هذا؟ decrease the aggregate supply. إذن شو اللي حيصير في aggregate supply؟ will shift to the left to aggregate supply 2. So this is point C suppose. إذن وين البوتنشال aggregate output long term aggregate output اللي هو الواي نوت. أنا رسمي هيك حتوضح أكثر. شايفين شو اللي صار؟ هلا بداية أرجع للرسم الانيشال figure. هلا this is the original equilibrium point, right؟ مظبوط. هيها عندي الاجريجيت short run aggregate supply مع aggregate demand مع aggregate long run aggregate supply, right؟ هذا y node is the original equilibrium point. تمام؟ او هذا بسموه هو البوتنشال aggregate output او البوتنشال GDP. تمام؟ طيب suppose انه we use an expansionary fiscal policy. يعني جينا عاملين expansionary fiscal policy ورايحين من هذا شو حيعمل؟ would increase aggregate demand 1 لو aggregate demand 2. صح؟ مظبوط؟ we have a new equilibrium point. هذا نوت خلينا نسميه نوت 1. E1 E نوت. شو the prices increased to B1. Y increased from Y node to Y1. صح؟ هلا شو اللي صار؟ الانكريزنج اللي صار في البرايسز عمل انكريزنج في الويجز، انكريز في الكوست اوف برودكشن، وبالتالي صار في finally aggregate supply would decline. So this leads to a leftward shifting from the F to the aggregate supply curve to the aggregate supply 2. We have finally we will reach to this point. ايه هذا البوتنشال GDP with increasing the prices. That's it. وضحت؟ إذا صار في عندي باللونج تيرم yes. Exactly yes. But the increasing the prices is increasing the wages, which is part of the cost of production. And then the aggregate cost. أنا بنحلل من وجهة نظر مين؟ Keynesian theory هيك بدي أقول. صح؟ طيب. So هذا هو البوتنشال جي دي بي، أقصى حاجة ممكن يوصلها الأوتبوت تبعنا اللي هو الواي نوت، يعني ممكن يزيد وبالتالي يرجع ينخفض لواي نوت from y1 node to y1 and then come back. هذا اسمه البوتنشال GDP. يعطيكم العافية. المرة الجاية نكمل.